But Coffindafer was not confused. By day 2, she was already telling Newsweek something that the public was not ready to hear. She said, "The person who approached that door keeps their head down and heads straight for the camera. They knew exactly where it was."
There are homes that hold secrets, and there are people trained to find them. Jennifer Coffindaffer is one of those people, not because she reads about cases on the internet, not because she follows true crime forums or listens to podcasts between commercials, but because she spent 28 years inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation doing the one thing most people will never do in their lifetime. She hunted the worst human beings on Earth. She built cases from silence. She sat across tables from people who had done unimaginable things, and she read them the way a surgeon reads an X-ray. With precision, with patience, with a kind of cold, trained clarity that does not come from talent alone. It comes from decades, and when Jennifer Coffindaffer turned that clarity toward the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, what she found was not what the public expected. It was not what the cameras outside that Tucson home could see. It was not what the headlines were saying, or what the press conferences were offering, or what the neighbors standing behind the yellow tape could possibly have imagined. What she found was something else entirely, something that made investigators go quiet.
She already knew what was inside. And what she found, working through the evidence, the footage, the forensic reports, the ransom notes, the behavioral patterns, the digital trail, what she found in this case is something that will disturb you in a way that no photograph ever could.
Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She lived alone in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona, in a home she had shared with her husband before he passed. She moved through her rooms with a walker. Her heart required a pacemaker, a small device implanted in her chest that kept her alive by keeping her heart in rhythm. Every single night, at exactly 2:28 in the morning, that pacemaker transmitted data to her healthcare provider. It was the kind of medical routine that becomes invisible when everything is normal. Automatic, expected, easy to ignore, until the night it went silent. On the morning of February 1, 2026, Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her home. She was taken from her bed, carried out of the house she had lived in for years, transported to a location that has not been publicly identified to this day. And the window in which all of that happened, the entire operation of taking an 84-year-old woman from her home in the dark, was 16 minutes. 16 minutes. Let that land for a moment.
One sentence. That was all she needed. Because in 28 years of FBI work, Jennifer Coffindaffer had learnt that the difference between a stranger crime and a targeted crime is visible in the first 3 seconds of surveillance footage.
This is the case that Jennifer Coffindaffer walked into. Not from the outside, not from a television studio. She walked through the evidence the way she walked through crime scenes for nearly 3 decades. Methodically, room by room, detail by detail. And what she found inside this case, inside the footage, the forensic reports, the behavioral patterns, the digital trail, the ransom notes, the timeline, is something that no photograph, no news segment, and no press release has fully captured. Her conclusion is chilling, and by the end of this, you will understand exactly why. Hi viewers. Before we go any further into what Jennifer Coffindaffer discovered inside this case, here is a simple question for you to answer in the comments right now. Do you believe Nancy Guthrie was taken by someone she knew, or by a complete stranger? Leave your answer below. One word is enough, because what comes next in this investigation may completely change your answer. The house sat quiet in the Catalina foothills the way it always did. From the street, nothing looked wrong. A retired woman's home, modest, private, the kind of neighborhood where people wave from driveways and leave porch lights on at night. The kind of street where an 84-year-old woman should have been completely safe behind her locked doors and her security gate and her Google Nest doorbell camera mounted at the front entrance.
Coffindafer broke this down with the kind of calm, methodical precision that only comes from years of processing violent crime scenes. She explained it simply. A stranger doing reconnaissance on a property from the outside, studying it, planning an approach, does not get access to the rear of a secured home in advance.
Should have been, but Jennifer Coffindaffer did not look at that house the way a neighbor would. She looked at it the way the FBI trained her to look at everything. as a crime scene, as a document, as a place that had already told its story in evidence, and was waiting for someone qualified enough to read it. And the first thing she read stopped her cold. The rear doors of Nancy Guthrie's home were not broken. They were not forced. There was no damage to the frame, no shattered glass, no sign of struggle at the back of the property. Those doors were propped open, deliberately, intentionally, as if someone had walked through them, reached back, and made sure they would stay accessible. Before any of this happened, that single detail, 4 words, propped open from inside, told Jennifer Coffindaffer something that most people covering this case had not yet been willing to say out loud. And it was only the beginning of what she found when she walked through this evidence. Because beyond the rear doors, beyond the doorbell footage, beyond the forensic reports, there was a digital trail. A timeline, a behavioral signature, and a conclusion that she delivered not with emotion, not with hesitation.
Here is where Coffindaffer's verdict becomes something that most people covering this case have not been willing to fully say out loud. She said it, clearly, on the record. I don't think this is a solo operation. There is someone orchestrating this entire situation.
But with the quiet, devastating certainty of someone who has seen this before. This is the Nancy Guthrie case. And this is what Jennifer Coffindaffer found inside. There are details in a crime scene that speak loudly. And then there are details that whisper. Jennifer Coffindaffer has spent a lifetime learning to hear both. The rear doors of Nancy Guthrie's home were whispering. And what they said changed everything about how this case needed to be understood. Because in 28 years of FBI work, Jennifer Coffindaffer had learned one thing about propped doors. They do not prop themselves. Someone with a reason, someone with a plan, someone who had already been inside that home and knew exactly which door to leave open and exactly how to leave it, had done that deliberately. Before the night of February 1st, before the masked figure appeared on the doorbell camera, before any of it began, think about what that means. A stranger casing a property from the outside, driving past slowly, studying the street angles, counting the cameras, noting the entry points, does not get access to the interior of a secured home in advance. A stranger does not walk through a locked rear door, prop it open from the inside, and walk back out. A stranger does not know which door leads where, which hallway connects to which room, or how the back of the property connects to the front. But someone who had been welcomed inside before? That person knows all of it. Jennifer Coffindaffer laid this out with the kind of calm, unhurried precision that only comes from years of processing violent crime scenes. She did not raise her voice. She did not speculate. She simply explained what the evidence showed, and let the weight of it settle on its own. A propped rear door in a home like this, in a case like this, is not a coincidence. It is preparation. It is someone saying, without words, I have already been here. I already know the way. And I will be back. The doorbell footage confirmed the rest. At 1:47 in the morning on February 1, 2026, a masked and gloved individual appeared at Nancy Guthrie's front doorstep. Watch the footage carefully, and what you see is not the behavior of someone approaching an unfamiliar house for the first time. There is no hesitation at the gate, no pause to look around, no moment of scanning the front of the property to locate the camera. The figure walks directly to the doorbell device, head down, deliberate, and removes it from the wall. That is not instinct, that is knowledge. Jennifer Coffindaffer said it plainly in her Newsweek analysis. The person who approached that door keeps their head down and heads straight for the camera. They knew exactly where it was. One sentence. That was her entire assessment of the footage. Because in her world, one sentence is sometimes all you need. In 28 years of FBI work, she had learned that the difference between a stranger crime and a targeted crime is visible in the first 3 seconds of surveillance footage. And what those 3 seconds showed her was not a stranger. This was someone who had stood at that front door before. Now look at the timeline. Because this is where Jennifer Coffindaffer's analysis becomes something that is very difficult to look away from. At 9:50 in the evening on January 31, 2026, Nancy Guthrie arrived home after a family dinner. She was dropped off at her front door by someone who knew the address. Someone who had been to this house many times before. Someone who had sat in those rooms, walked those hallways, stood at that front door, and knew exactly where every camera was positioned. Nancy went inside. The lights eventually went dark. And then the clock started. 1:47 in the morning. The masked figure appears. Between Nancy's arrival home and that moment at the front door, 3 hours and 57 minutes had passed. Jennifer Coffindaffer pointed to that window repeatedly, not as an accusation, as mathematics, because 3 hours and 57 minutes is enough time to drive somewhere and return. It is enough time to change clothes and gather materials. It is enough time to position yourself, wait for the house to go completely still, and move toward a rear door that you already know is propped open and waiting. At 2:12 in the morning, motion was detected at the front of the property. At 2:28, Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker missed its scheduled nightly transmission. 16 minutes. In 16 minutes, an 84-year-old woman who used a walker to cross her own living room was removed from her bed, moved through her home, carried out of the building she had lived in for years, and transported to a location that investigators have not publicly identified to this day. 16 minutes from the first motion alert to the moment her heart monitor went silent. Jennifer Coffindaffer's assessment of that window was direct and without softening. This level of speed, this level of control, this level of operational precision, it does not happen without knowledge. Knowledge of the layout, knowledge of Nancy's physical limitations, knowledge of exactly which route through that home would allow someone to move her out as quickly and as quietly as possible. Stop and sit with that for a moment. This was not improvised. This was not a crime of opportunity. Every second of those 16 minutes had been accounted for in advance. Every turn through that house had been mentally rehearsed. Every obstacle, every door, every exit point had been considered before the night it was needed. And the person who did that mental rehearsal had walked those exact rooms before. Not in the dark, in the light, as a guest. And then Coffindafer looked at something no camera crew had thought to examine. Something that happened not on the night Nancy disappeared, but 10 months before it. And what she found in that direction would reframe the entire case in a way that the public was not ready for. Someone had been watching this house for almost a year. Before the masks, before the gloves, before the doorbell camera was ripped from the wall. Before any of it, someone had been sitting at a device, opening a search engine, and typing Nancy Guthrie's home address into a field with one specific purpose: to study the exterior of that property from the safety of a screen. In March of 2025, 10 months before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, someone conducted an image search for her home address. They pulled up photographs of the exterior, the driveway, the front door, the angles from the street, the sight lines from the sidewalk to the entrance, the position of the cameras. They studied it, and then they stopped. And then in November, specifically between November 30th and December 1st of 2025, exactly 60 days before the abduction, someone did it again. A second round of searches. The same address, the same property, the same deliberate, methodical examination of the exterior of an 84-year-old woman's home. 2 separate sessions, 10 months apart. The FBI subpoenaed Google for the IP address data connected to those searches. The device, the account, the digital trail that leads directly back to whoever sat at that keyboard and typed Nancy Guthrie's address into a search engine with a purpose that had nothing to do with curiosity. Jennifer Coffindaffer's response to this detail was measured, but the implication behind her words was unmistakable. She posed it as a question that answered itself. Consider who did not need to conduct that reconnaissance. Consider who already knew that house, who had visited it many times, who knew where the cameras were positioned, where the doors were located, where the pacemaker monitor sat beside the bed at night. For that person, running image searches of the exterior of Nancy's home in March and again in November was not about learning what the house looked like. It was about confirming something specific, verifying a camera angle, checking a sightline, making absolutely certain that the approach they had already planned in their mind would work exactly the way they needed it to when the moment came. That is not a stranger researching an unfamiliar target. That is someone who already knows the inside of a home, using digital tools to make sure the outside matches the plan. Jennifer Coffindaffer then said something that drew a line through everything else she had analyzed. She said it clearly, on the record, without hesitation. I do not think this is a solo operation. There is someone orchestrating this entire situation. The masked figure on the doorbell camera, the person investigators have publicly identified as the suspect, was not, in Coffindaffer's professional assessment, the architect of what happened to Nancy Guthrie. He was the instrument, the person who physically carried out the abduction. But behind him, coordinating, planning, providing information, making decisions, was someone else. Someone operating at a different level. Someone with more to protect. Someone intelligent enough to understand that direct involvement would be catastrophic, and careful enough to keep their own hands clean. That person is why the masked suspect walked directly to the camera without looking up. That person is why the rear door was already open. That person is why the approach at 1:47 in the morning landed precisely in the window after Nancy would have gone to sleep but before her pacemaker transmission would alert anyone that something had gone wrong. Nobody arrives at an 84-year-old woman's home at that hour with that level of precision unless someone who knows that home, knows that woman, and knows that family gave them every single detail they needed. The FBI has the IP address data now. They have the device records. They have the account information connected to those searches. And Jennifer Coffindaffer, who spent 28 years watching digital evidence crack cases that seemed impossible, is watching that thread get pulled in real time. But nothing she found in the physical evidence, not the propped door, not the camera footage, not the digital reconnaissance trail, disturbed her more professionally than what she found when she turned her attention to the ransom notes. Because the ransom notes did not behave like ransom notes. And that absence of normal behavior told her something darker than almost anything else in this case. The notes were not sent only to law enforcement. They were not delivered quietly to the Guthrie family through private channels the way a genuine ransom demand operates. They were sent to TMZ. They were sent to national broadcast networks. They were distributed to news organizations with millions of daily viewers. Deliberately, strategically, with full understanding of exactly what kind of public pressure that distribution would create. Think about that choice for a moment. A person who takes someone for financial reasons negotiates privately. They keep communication contained. They avoid the kind of national media attention that multiplies the risk of getting caught by an enormous factor. They provide proof of life because without it, the negotiation has no mechanism. The leverage disappears. There is nothing credible to demand payment against. The Nancy Guthrie ransom notes contained no proof of life. None. Jennifer Coffindaffer's analysis of that absence was one of the darkest verdicts in this entire investigation. She was precise about it. The notes, the way they were written, the way they were distributed to media rather than kept private, the complete absence of any credible demand mechanism, pointed toward someone who was not expecting to negotiate. Someone who already knew the outcome. Someone whose real objective was never $6 million in Bitcoin. The goal was the public humiliation of a family. To force Savannah Guthrie in front of cameras in a position of helplessness. To make a family that someone had decided needed to be destroyed stand in front of a national audience and look like they had no control over what was happening. That is what the public distribution of those notes accomplished. Not leverage, not negotiation, exposure, pressure, humiliation executed in front of millions of people. And here is what Coffindafer underlined in her analysis. To understand that public perception matters enormously to the Guthrie family, to understand the specific pressure that national exposure would create, to understand that distributing those notes to TMZ would put Savannah Guthrie in an impossible public position, you would need to know this family. Not from watching the morning news. Not from reading articles. From sitting at their table. From being inside their world. That knowledge is intimate. That knowledge is personal. And it was being weaponized. While the person behind those notes sat somewhere watching every press conference, every headline, every camera pointed at a grieving family, the investigation that was supposed to stop them was quietly coming apart at the seams. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos did not escape Jennifer Coffindaffer's assessment. And she did not wait long to deliver it. Within days of the investigation beginning, she was already on air identifying what she described as fundamental institutional failures that were damaging the case in real time. The crime scene at Nancy Guthrie's home was left unsecured in the critical early hours. A national television crew walked directly up to the front door and knocked on it. Nancy's blood, which would later be confirmed through testing, was on the front doorstep and accessible to anyone who approached the property. The physical record of what happened at that entrance on the night of February 1st was exposed to contamination before proper scene security was ever established. Coffindafer did not deliver that assessment academically. She delivered it like someone who understood exactly what it cost. There are no do-overs in crime scenes. Whatever evidence existed on that property in the first 12 hours, whatever trace materials, whatever physical record had been left behind by whoever stood at that front door, was potentially compromised by the absence of basic procedural control. That is not a recoverable situation. You cannot go back. You cannot recollect what has already been disturbed. And then came the glove. Found approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. The glove appeared to match the gloves worn by the suspect in the doorbell camera footage. It was processed for DNA. An unknown male profile was recovered. That profile did not match anyone in the federal database. It was a significant piece of physical evidence in an investigation involving a missing 84-year-old woman who required daily medication to survive. Sheriff Nanos sent it to a private laboratory in Florida. Not to the FBI laboratory at Quantico. Not to the most advanced forensic facility in the country, the one with probabilistic genotyping capabilities that private labs simply cannot replicate. A private lab in Florida. 11 weeks passed. 11 weeks during which the most important piece of physical evidence in this case sat in the wrong building while an elderly woman remained missing. 11 weeks during which the DNA profile that might have identified her abductor waited. Coffindafer called it what it was. A failure of professional judgment that cost the investigation time it could not afford to lose. When the evidence finally reached Quantico, after public pressure, after congressional attention, after Sheriff Nanos was questioned under oath about the handling of the case, Coffindafer made a statement that carries a weight that does not diminish the more you think about it. She said the FBI was starting from scratch, not building on progress, not accelerating an existing trajectory, starting over, from the beginning. Because the weeks that should have been spent processing the most critical physical evidence in the case through the most capable forensic system available had been spent waiting in Florida. And yet, despite everything, despite the compromised crime scene, despite the 11-week delay, despite the institutional failures that Coffindafer documented publicly and without hesitation, she did not say this case was over. She did not say the trail had gone cold. She did not accept the quiet narrative that began circulating in media coverage around the 40, 50, 60-day mark suggesting that the investigation had stalled and the leads had dried up. She pushed back against that narrative with everything she had. This case is red hot. It is not cold. It will never be cold as long as Nancy Guthrie is missing. And then she explained exactly why. Not with emotion, with evidence. The FBI had DNA at Quantico being processed through probabilistic genotyping software. This is not standard DNA comparison technology. It does not simply search for an existing match in a database. It builds statistical models from complex mixture samples. It isolates individual contributor profiles with mathematical precision that was not available to investigators even 10 years ago. The capabilities at Quantico represent a level of forensic analysis that no private Florida laboratory could replicate, and the unknown male profile recovered from that glove was now inside that system. The FBI had cell tower data being assembled by the Bureau's Cell Site Analysis Unit, a specialized team that maps the digital footprint of every mobile device active in a specific geographic area during a specific window of time. Every phone that was anywhere near the Catalina foothills on the night of January 31st and the early morning hours of February 1, 2026, is inside that dataset. Every movement, every network ping, every record of where those devices were and when. The FBI had the Google subpoena data, the IP address records from the image searches conducted in March of 2025 and again in late November of 2025. The device, the account, the person who sat at a keyboard and researched Nancy Guthrie's home address on 2 separate occasions in the months before she was taken. And the FBI had the Bitcoin wallet, a wallet that received a small deposit on February 10, 2026, accompanied by the message, "We are ready to talk." Blockchain forensics teams do not lose that trail. Every transaction in a blockchain is permanent. Every wallet that ever interacted with that address is part of a visible, unalterable record. Every exchange that ever processed funds connected to it exists in the data. The trail does not disappear. It never disappears. Coffindafer then said something that law enforcement sources had confirmed but not publicized. Law enforcement has known who the subject is for some time. Read that again. They knew. They had known. And the reason no arrest had been made was not because the investigation had stalled. It was because the evidence being constructed at Quantico, the DNA, the digital records, the behavioral profile, the financial trail, needed to be absolutely airtight before it ever went before a grand jury. Because the person at the center of this case is someone who will arrive with resources, with attorneys, with a public platform from which to challenge every single piece of evidence presented against them. Coffindafer was not going to let this case fall apart because prosecutors moved before the evidence was ready. She had seen that happen before. And then in April of 2026, she made a statement about the psychology of whoever is responsible for this that reframed the entire behavioral picture of the case. She said the suspect has a God complex. The specific religious language embedded in the ransom notes, phrasing that behavioral analysts flagged as unlike standard ransom communication, pointed to someone who genuinely believed, that they were operating above consequence. Someone whose confidence in their own planning, their own intelligence, their own understanding of how the family and law enforcement would respond had convinced them that they could not be touched. That psychology has a very specific behavioral signature. A person with a God complex does not go quiet when the pressure increases. They push back, they make moves, they cannot stop themselves. The need to demonstrate superiority over investigators, over the family, over the public watching this unfold, it compels them to act even when acting is the most dangerous possible choice. Sending ransom notes to TMZ was the act of someone who believed they could not be caught. Propping that rear door with calm, unhurried preparation was the act of someone who believed their plan was perfect. Running Google image searches of Nancy Guthrie's home on a device connected to an account, months before the abduction, was the act of someone who believed that level of digital trail would never matter. They were wrong on every count. And Jennifer Coffindafer has seen that exact psychology before. She has watched people who believed themselves untouchable make the one error that breaks everything open. She said it clearly. They always make one error. The DNA they did not account for. The cell tower data they forgot was being recorded. The blockchain transaction they believed was invisible. The IP address they thought would disappear. One of those threads is going to pull. And when it does, the same God complex that convinced someone they could take an 84-year-old woman from her bed in the middle of the night and walk away untouched, will be the exact same psychology that handed investigators everything they needed to finish this. As of the most recent reporting on this case, Nancy Guthrie has been missing for more than 90 days. She is 84 years old. She requires medication to survive. She has a heart condition that makes every single day that passes carry a weight that is very difficult to fully sit with. And yet Jennifer Coffindafer has not stepped back from this case for a single moment. She has not let the public forget. She has not accepted the silence. She has not allowed the comfortable drift toward cold case language to go unchallenged. Her final verdict on this investigation was delivered calmly, professionally, by someone who has spent a lifetime in this work and has earned every word of what she says. Finding Nancy alive was Objective 1. Objective 2 is getting an abductor, and in her professional assessment, likely something far worse, off the streets. That is not a dramatic flourish for a camera. That is the considered conclusion of a retired FBI special agent who has looked at every publicly available piece of evidence in this case and reached a verdict based on 28 years of knowing exactly what she is looking at. The investigation is not over. New evidence is at Quantico right now. A blockchain forensics team is working the Bitcoin wallet right now. Cell tower data is being cross-referenced against known individuals right now. And the IP address connected to those Google searches, the digital fingerprint left behind by someone who believed they were invisible, is inside a federal database right now. One thread. That is all it takes. Jennifer Coffindafer has watched that moment happen more times than most people can count. The moment when one thread, pulled at exactly the right angle, brings everything else down with it. She is still watching this case. She has not looked away. And the reason she has not looked away is the same reason this investigation is not over. Because somewhere out there, Nancy Guthrie is still waiting. And in the next video, something shifts in this case that even Jennifer Coffindafer did not see coming. A piece of information surfaced recently that changes the direction of the entire investigation, and it connects directly to the digital trail the FBI has been following since the beginning. If you have been watching this case from the start, you cannot afford to miss what comes next. Subscribe now and turn on your notifications, because when this breaks, you will want to have been here.